An Introduction to the Sociology of Education. Everyone has an opinion on education. Politicians often talk about education as a solution to social problems. Others blame persistent inequality and poverty on substandard education. Our education system is hotly debated. Every few years or so, we ask ourselves, are schools failing our children? What can be done to fix it? With education, everyone is an expert. Everyone has had direct, prolonged experience with the education system over the course of their lives and has a perspective on what is wrong or right with our current educational system. Educational issues, whether over teacher pay, school funding, or curriculum standards, quickly become personal and are often ideological and divisive in nature. The sociology of education takes all these questions and issues about education and looks to social systems and the structure of society to find answers. By studying education sociologically, we can attempt to view our own personal experiences with education in a broader context, by understanding the ways in which larger social structures have shaped and impacted our educational experience. The sociology of education is the study of educational structures, processes, and practices from a sociological perspective, meaning that the theories and methods common to sociology are applied to educational issues. Sociology of education focuses on the interactions between broader structures in society and what happens in schools. It works to understand schooling by analyzing how social forces, like families, poverty, inequality, the economy, or discrimination, impact education. Emil Durkheim, a renowned sociologist in the late 1800s and early 1900s, laid the foundations for a sociology of education in his texts Education in Society, Moral Education, and The Evolution of Educational Thought. Durkheim was one of the first sociologists to explicitly examine the role schools play in educating students to participate in social systems. Durkheim was interested in the ways in which schools socialize students to become productive members of society. His work on moral education in particular highlights his interest in the socializing function of schools. Since Durkheim's texts were published, the field of sociology of education has grown rapidly and is taught in departments of sociology and departments of education across the world. While Durkheim was one of the first to examine schools through a sociological lens, others have critiqued and transformed the ways that we use sociology to look at education. The field of sociology of education can be broken into four main theoretical perspectives: functionalism, conflict theory, critical theory, and interpretivism. Each of these perspectives analyzes education through a different sociological lens and come to very different conclusions about the role of education in our society. First, functionalism. Durkheim, one of the founders of the sociology of education, was a functionalist, meaning that he believed education served a crucial role in training students to become productive members of broader society. Functionalists are concerned, above all, with maintaining social order. They view education as a way to maintain equilibrium and stability in society. It is important to note that functionalism takes a macro lens to education by studying groups and social structures, not individuals. Above all else, functionalists value stability in society. They view change as pathological and seek to reduce conflict. Functionalists, such as Durkheim in the early 1900s and later Talcott Parsons in the 1960s, conceptualize society using metaphors of the body. Functionalism as an ideology draws its ideas from the field of biology. Viewing society as a body, functionalism uses the analogy that societal institutions, such as schools, families, and churches, are all organs in the body that must function properly in order for the success of society as a whole. Think of schools like an arm. If the arm stops working, the body cannot function. Similarly, if schools do not work correctly, society ceases to function properly. Schools are tasked with socializing students to fulfill society's needs. Schools train students accordingly and allocate them to specific jobs based on their performance. Functionalist theory stresses transmission, how generations pass on culture, knowledge, and rules to future generations. This transmission can be done effectively through schools. For example, take cultural customs in schools concerning patriotism. reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, learning about the Founding Fathers, or celebrating national holidays. Functionalists love these activities because they work to transmit cultural values through generations and assimilate children to dominant cultural forms. Functionalism transmits values of independence, you're responsible for your own actions, and achievement, you should work hard and succeed to better yourself in society. It also rests firmly upon the notion of meritocracy, that if you work hard, you will succeed. This transmission process rests on latent and manifest functions of schooling. Basically, the manifest function of schooling is what we assume and believe schools to do, their recognized and intended purpose, to teach our children so they can succeed. Latent functions, however, are the functions that serve the needs of society but are not recognized or acknowledged by its members. Schools serve the latent function of socializing workers to fulfill particular roles in the labor force. Schools create CEOs, teachers, and the unemployed. The central tenets of functionalist theory, maintaining equilibrium, preaching meritocracy, and transmitting rules and customs, open it up to major critique. Many scholars fault functionalist thinking for maintaining the status quo. Social change and conflict are regarded as aberrations, not essential tools in advancing society. Functionalism reinforces the existing ruling social and political order, regardless of how just or unjust that order may be. Because of its insistence on order and stability, functionalist theory can be viewed as overly concerned with maintaining equilibrium at the expense of social justice. John Dewey, a progressive educator, was criticized for his functionalist perspective on vocational training for African American students. He argued that it made sense to encourage these students to attend vocational schools in light of their economic situations. This training would ensure they would become productive members of society. However, others pushed back against this, arguing that Dewey pigeonholed students of particular races into jobs and that this was unjust and biased, even if it did lead to stability and social equilibrium. Functionalism can also be critiqued for forcing assimilation at the expense of diverse cultures and beliefs. By forcing immigrants to assimilate to dominant cultural values and beliefs in the name of social cohesion and equilibrium, functionalism erases diversity and forces compliance to the dominant culture. And finally, functionalism's firm faith in a meritocratic society can be seen as at odds with lived realities of discrimination and unequal opportunity. So, let's go over some key terms in functionalism. We start off with the metaphor of the body and functionalism's need for equilibrium. We also need to consider that functionalism is taking a macro lens to society, not an individual or micro lens. Then there's the transmission of cultural values through its manifest and latent functions. And finally, there's the critique on functionalism's emphasis on stability and social order at the expense of social change. Conflict theory rejects the functionalist viewpoint of a meritocracy. At its heart, conflict theory is concerned with structural inequality and argues that the driving force in society is class conflict. Schools are instrumental in this struggle. Conflict theorists tend to draw their ideas from Marx, who argued that society is made up of two classes, the oppressed and the oppressors, and that these divisions in society are drawn on primarily socioeconomic lines. Conflict theory rests on a class-based analysis of social issues. It views socioeconomic status, not race, gender, ability, sexual orientation, etc., as the primary determinant of social outcomes. Some conflict theorists have been criticized for failing to consider intersectionalities of oppression, like gender, but we'll get to that later. Paulo Freire, one of the founders of conflict theory, was a liberation theologian in Brazil in the 1900s and employs Marxism to critique capitalist society. He urges oppressed classes to liberate themselves from the dominant class. He argues that oppressed peoples must gain critical consciousness of their own oppression before there can be a revolution. Until then, oppression dehumanizes both the oppressed and the oppressor. This is inevitable under a capitalist system. To clarify how both groups are dehumanized, think of a man in a patriarchal society. He is dehumanized and prevented from becoming his true self, for example, by crying publicly, because of patriarchal constructs that reinforce a particular form of masculinity. In the same way, oppressors are dehumanized in Freire's theories because oppressors cannot truly be free when others are oppressed. As well, only the oppressed have the power and ability to liberate themselves and their oppressors from these destructive relationships. Any attempt by the dominant or oppressor class to liberate the oppressed is what Freire calls false generosity. It is disingenuous and only serves to reinforce power relationships. This is where education comes in. Freire articulates the need for a true pedagogy of the oppressed, where oppressed peoples learn about oppression and its causes and work to liberate themselves from oppression. In order to achieve this liberation, Freire speaks of the importance of praxis in education. Praxis is a combination of action and reflection. Without reflection, activism is often too hasty and thoughtless. However, without sustained action, reflection is useless. Another major concept that Freire highlights that is critical to conflict theory is the idea of banking education. Banking education is an instrument of oppression. It basically entails a teacher filling a student up with knowledge while the student passively receives it. Students are not active agents, but receptacles to be filled up. Banking education works to socialize students to accept inequalities and injustices and not question authority. Freire harshly critiques the model of banking education, which he views as ubiquitous in public schools, and argues for a critical, problem-posing pedagogy. While education has the potential to liberate minds and work for social change, as Freire articulates, conflict theory also argues that the educational system of an unequal, unjust country can never be just. Conflict theory is applied to education primarily when looking at the ways in which schools prepare students to participate in a capitalist labor force. Bowles and Gintis's seminal text, Schooling in Capitalist America, outline how schools socialize students to reproduce unequal labor relationships. Their theory of economic reproduction boils down to working-class kids go to working-class schools and then are trained to fill working-class jobs. Labor relationships are produced through schooling. Your outcome in school is not dependent on how hard you try or even how smart you are. It is based on your social class. Just like in functionalism, schools work to socialize students. The difference in conflict theory is that schools are socializing students to replicate unjust relationships and power dynamics. Bowles and Gintis also outline correspondence theory. Schools, at least schools for primarily working class or students of color, eerily resemble factory life, from the strict schedules to harsh punishment for breaking rules to the often dull and dreary nature of everyday school life. In this way, schools train students to occupy the jobs their parents did. The greatest predictor of college attendance is not IQ, high school GPA, or ambition. It is most heavily correlated with your parents' socioeconomic status. Conflict theory underscores this relationship between class and educational success. Conflict theory also draws upon ideas of the hidden curriculum in explaining educational issues. The hidden curriculum is what is not taught but still transmitted, the implicit messages used to convey what is appropriate or right. In a capitalist economy, the hidden curriculum is used to transmit values and beliefs that legitimize inequality. Where an explicit curriculum would be something like a math textbook, the hidden curriculum is a less explicit, disguised form of instruction. An example of the hidden curriculum is how students learn to compete with one another in order to gain the teacher's approval. From an early age, students are taught to compete in order to succeed. This is a belief that isn't explicitly taught, but is nonetheless ingrained from an early age. In this way, the hidden curriculum trains students to adopt capitalist ways of thinking. Students are socialized to compete with each other to get jobs once they leave school. Just like functionalist theorists, conflict theorists focus on how society transmits values. The main difference between these two theories, however, is that functionalists think this transmission is benign and essential to societal functioning, Conflict theorists disagree, arguing that this hidden curriculum works to legitimize inequality. Bourdieu extends the idea of the hidden curriculum by focusing on cultural capital, which is defined as a non-financial asset that contributes to success in school and in life. He argues that schools value a very particular type of cultural capital, white, upper middle class, well-educated, and those that do not possess that kind of cultural capital are unintentionally or perhaps intentionally punished. For example, schools value a certain way of speaking and dressing. If you deviate from that pattern, you will run into problems with teachers and administrators correcting and disciplining you from a very early age. Cultural reproduction occurs as schools privilege culturally specific ways of acting, whether it's through linguistic practices that are embedded in the curriculum, proper ways of speaking, or grammar rules, or through cultural practices that may not be familiar to all students. Students from different cultures or socioeconomic statuses are at an inherent disadvantage in this environment because their specific cultural forms of knowledge are not valuable in the school setting. They lack cultural capital. Extending off of Bourdieu's cultural capital theory is his idea of the habitus. Schools have very deep-seated socialized norms of understanding and doing, called the habitus. The habitus allows subordinate groups to be reproduced and the dominant class to maintain its status without resorting to physical repression. The socialized attitudes and beliefs that the habitus teaches us, particularly in schools, guide and constrain our behavior. In this way, power is symbolically and culturally created by our actions and thoughts. Through the habitus, dominant groups can oppress subordinate ones without explicitly punishing them. This is called symbolic violence and works to effectively legitimize inequality. Habitus can be a very ambiguous concept, so here's a concrete example of the habitus at work in schools. Basically, think of habitus as your common sense. It's something that you learned unconsciously but seems to be almost natural to you now. In schools, part of your habitus is to respond to the sounds of bells ringing to signal the end of class. You stand up, pack up your things, and leave at the sound of the bell. This seems to be common sense, but is actually our habitus. This shows us how our habitus shapes and directs our actions. For Bowles and Gintis and other conflict theorists, this habitus reflects the socialization of students to reproduce labor relationships. Students learn to follow the sound of the school bell and obey orders, just like they will learn to follow similar signs and symbols in the factory or workplace. A major theme in conflict theory is how the state can control ideas and behavior. The state can control behavior through the repressive state apparatus, the RSA, or, more commonly, through the ideological state apparatus, ISA. The repressive state apparatus is basically overt forms of control. For example, during slavery, whipping slaves, or using overt military force. It is an explicit form of discipline and control. In contrast, many societies use more covert forms of control in the form of the ideological state apparatus. The ISA reinforces the power of the dominant class through ideologies and cultural forces. Althusser, a Marxist theorist, views schools as the primary tool of the ISA because schools reproduce labor relationships by training students to become productive workers. He argues that the education ISA conceals and masks the ruling class ideology behind its liberating qualities so that its hidden agendas become inconspicuous to the parents of the students. In summary, conflict theory is inherently a revolutionary perspective. It believes that educational equality cannot be achieved without a fundamental transformation of economic structures. Schools are not the great equalizers that functionalist theory makes them out to be. In fact, they are ideal instruments in a capitalist economy and work to reproduce unequal relationships. Both functionalism and conflict theory are macro perspectives, and both focus on how values are transmitted. These two theories, however, ultimately come to very different conclusions about the kind of society we live in. Conflict theory has been criticized for being overly deterministic and not allowing room for individuality and human agency. In conflict theory, social class is your destiny. This obscures the ways in which students resist authority and try to disrupt unjust systems. Conflict theory also does not engage with other forms of oppression besides class. How were women treated differently under a capitalist system? What about people of color? Critical theory, another major theoretical perspective in the sociology of education, can be thought of as an offshoot of conflict theory that actually addresses concerns about intersectionality and agency. Now let's go over some key terms in conflict theory. We start with class conflict and Marxism. Conflict theory ultimately is based on a Marxist view of society that emphasizes class struggle. We have Freire's work around critical consciousness and praxis and how education is the key to liberation. We also have Freire's critique of banking education and his desire for a problem-posing pedagogy. And then we have Bowles and Gintis's social reproduction theory, where working-class kids go to working-class schools, etc., as well as their correspondence theory. Schools are a factory. Then there's the hidden curriculum and its transmission of values, and Bourdieu's cultural capital theory, where certain forms of being and thinking are privileged. And then there's the ideological state apparatus function and how it subtly reinforces inequality. And finally, there's the critique of conflict theory. It's too deterministic, it's not based in reality, and it's not intersectional enough. Next, let's move to critical theory. The main goal of critical theory is to unmask sources of oppression, to promote understanding of the causes and consequences of oppression, and to encourage participation and liberation. Critical theory assumes that conventional social theories are a tool of ruling elites who want to perpetuate oppression. It argues that humans are oppressed because power is hidden or disguised. People are unfree because of this. Drawing on conflict theories of injustice and oppression, critical theory acknowledges how social class perpetuates inequality. However, critical theory also points toward the ways in which individuals can be oppressed by other identities besides class. For example, one's race, gender, nationality, ability, or sexual orientation can be targets for oppression. Viewing society as divided solely by class is much too simplistic in critical theory. Unlike conflict and functionalist theory, which are macro perspectives, critical theory draws on more micro frameworks as well. It values human agency in individual circumstances. It is not as overly deterministic and broad as either of the other two theories. In critical theory, there is interaction between individuals and structures. Individuals are not by any means free to do whatever they want in an unequal society, but at the same time, they are not doomed by birth to occupy irreversible roles. Critical theory also works to fundamentally deconstruct social structures. It wants to deconstruct knowledge and complicate how social science and the academy produce knowledge. It wants to complicate discourses around privilege and critically examine how schools reproduce privilege and inequality. Like conflict theory, critical theory argues that the hidden curriculum shapes schooling and that schools play a major role in social reproduction. Critical theory differs from conflict theory in that it leaves room for agency. In critical theory, while inequality and injustice may never disappear, there is space and power for individuals to create social change. Because of critical theory's faith in individuals' ability to resist hegemonic structures, it has a valuable application in the field of education. Critical theory, as a perspective that moves beyond a solely class-based analysis, considers how race, gender, ability, and other identities play into oppressive structures. Critical multiculturalism is a growing field in the sociology of education that seeks to understand different cultures in a more nuanced way than the predominant model of food, folklore, and festivals. This perspective emphasizes intersectionality and gets away from essentialist forms of thinking. An explicitly Marxist perspective is often employed in critical theory as well, in order to analyze, much like conflict theory, how social class often dictates outcome. Critical theory also utilizes critical race theory, CRT. In brief, critical race theory, which is an offshoot of critical legal studies, is a theory based on the assumption that we live in a white supremacist society that rewards certain individuals based on their race. Racism is systemic and institutionalized. Whiteness carries intrinsic benefits. CRT uses storytelling and an emphasis on lived experiences to disrupt dominant narratives around race. CRT attempts to rewrite the white supremacist master script. In contrast to identity-based perspectives in critical theory, post-structuralism, another major theoretical framework in critical theory, attempts to move the discussion away from categories and large structures and more towards discourse and language, and how behavior is shaped through these institutions. This comes up again and again in education, particularly in curriculum studies, when we examine the kinds of knowledge that are privileged in textbooks and on exams. An extremely recent example of how knowledge and language shape our understanding and work to give power to dominant groups is the controversy over a McGraw-Hill history textbook that inaccurately describes enslaved Africans in the United States as workers and immigrants, instead of as slaves. This highlights how language can construct meanings and warp understandings of history. Post-structuralism also emphasizes deconstructing binaries. Post-structuralists similarly believe in an unequal society and believe that this inequality is due to how we construct knowledge. Working from the viewpoint that knowledge is socially constructed, post-structuralists view binaries as a form of oppression. For example, the binary between male and female inherently sets up a power dynamic. This dichotomy will inevitably lead to oppression. In fact, even discussing male and female on these terms creates a socially constructed view of reality that places men and women in separate, often unequal spheres. Another dangerous binary is the black-white binary, which necessarily essentializes individuals down to their race. By viewing society in these strict terms, you oppress alternative voices who feel as though they do not fit neatly into this binary. For example, gay black people are silenced by this binary because they do not have a way to express the intersectionality and multiple oppressions of race and sexual orientation that they face. Post-structuralists view the socially constructed nature of knowledge as a method to perpetuate harmful binaries that oppress and silence alternate voices. Because of this, post-structuralism advocates for a dismantling of social constructions in order to achieve equality. Critical theory acknowledges and reaffirms much of conflict theory. However, its major contribution is that it problematizes and expands on many of conflict theory's tenets. It focuses on knowledge production in education and on decolonizing ways of thinking and knowing. It also emphasizes individual agency and the power of counter-narratives and oppressed peoples to liberate themselves from large social structures. So, some major concepts to keep in mind with critical theory. Starting out, critical theory builds and shares a lot of frameworks with conflict theory. It looks at different forms of oppression, such as race, gender and ability, and sexual orientation. And it ultimately works to deconstruct knowledge, particularly in schools. And finally, interpretivism. Unlike functionalist and conflict theories, which take a large-scale approach to social structures, interpretivism focuses on micro-interactions. Interpretivism focuses on the social construction of meaning. Basically, interpretivism believes that meaning is created through interaction. Therefore, it studies individuals and the meanings they create in their daily lives. In education, interpretivists critique how functionalist, conflict, and even sometimes critical theorists can claim to know exactly what's going on in a school without even stepping foot in it. Generally, interpretivists don't like to offer large theories explaining social actions. Instead, they look to the specific cultures in each school. An interpretivist would go into a school and spend hours studying and observing students interact. A conflict theorist would not undertake these steps. In interpretivism, the focus is on the meaning we construct through language. There are three basic types of meaning that interpretivism identifies. First, the propositional content of a sentence, the verbal substance. Then, the relational content, referring to the relative positions of the speaker and the one who receives the speaking. And finally, the attitudinal content, the tone of the message. Ultimately, in interpretivism, we read the world like a social text. We must develop a shared structure and intelligibility in order to make connections and communicate. You've just learned about the 4 main theories in the sociology of education.